Well, good afternoon to you. It's the 24th of September 2019. I was just hoping to be able to talk with you in relation to Luke chapter 15 and the story of the prodigal, or what could be seen as the joy of the Father. And I hope to be able to do this over three different sessions with you. So as we begin, if we can just open up our Bibles to Luke chapter 15, and we'll just navigate through this chapter together. So there's a couple of things to sort of consider initially. Jesus very much in his teachings, we see his humanity and his compassion, and that's in Luke's Gospel, stressed and mentioned very often. From Luke 9 verses 51 through to 19 verses 28, the major theme for that section is the rejection of the Son of Man. And the teaching into Luke 15, its theme is in seeking the lost. If we were to summarize the book of Luke in one verse that represents that whole book, we would go to Luke 19 verse 10, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And we'll see that beautifully portrayed as we go through Luke 15 together. And I do want to thank you for your listening and your comments in relation to this teaching and this set of teachings. So first parable, the parable of the lost sheep, and then the parable of the lost coin. We see the teaching of three parables by Jesus is there to emphasize a point. And to properly understand that message, we need to understand what's being said in each of these parables. So let's go to the scriptures together. Luke 15 verses 1 and 2. Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and he eats with them." So to understand the significance of this statement, we need to consider that the Jewish culture at that time was very much a shame, honour-driven society that used shame and honour in a way that developed a sort of a caste system. And one would do everything to avoid bringing shame upon themselves or upon their family, and we'll look at that more closely as we go on. Virtually everything that was done in a Jewish culture either brought shame or honour to oneself or to the family or to the village. And the primary motivation in how things were done was based on seeking honour for oneself, as I've mentioned, and to avoid shame. So let's look at verse 1. Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near to him. So who were these tax collectors at this time? They were seen as the lowest of the low by the Jews in society at that time. The Romans were occupying that society, and tax collectors, they collected the taxes for the Jews, from the Jews rather, forgive me, and for the Romans. And the tax collectors, they greatly profited from this. And this was they were greatly despised by their own people for that. They were seen as traitors, and these tax collectors had profited greatly from this. Often these tax collectors were surrounded by criminals or thugs who did a lot of the work in collecting this. So we can appreciate that these tax collectors were greatly despised. If we now just take a moment and have a look at who are the sinners, the prostitutes, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, the pagans. And it was interesting that these people kept coming to Jesus. They were outcasts of society, unclean people, impure, not religious. And the thinking at the time was, if you had actually eaten with someone at your table, you affirmed them. And we see that the scribes and the Pharisees understood this thinking at that time. They also thought that Jesus was of the devil, that he was satanic in his association with them, in his eating with them. They believed that sinners belonged to the devil, and that included the Gentiles. The Pharisaic law even taught not to teach the law of God, and sought to have nothing to do with sinners. So we can see their thinking at this time. But what we do know is that Jesus loved the sinners, and he associated with them very comfortably. Verse 2, and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives and eats with them. That word receives is to welcome. So let's have a look at the Pharisees. So the Pharisees, they taught in the synagogues, influential men in society. They believed that they knew God, and they believed that they had represented God. The Pharisees thought themselves to be righteous teachers of the law, and all others were wicked. So we see that they really could not condemn Jesus' preaching to sinners, but very much thought it was inconsistent with someone so knowledgeable of the scriptures to be able to sit and to eat with them. We're going to see that Jesus taught these Pharisees and these scribes that they really did not know who God was and who God is. These scribes and Pharisees had tremendous power and influence and privilege in society at that time, were generally quite wealthy. These Pharisees knew that fathers were in charge of their families and were also in charge of their households at that time. And the Pharisees sought and thought themselves to be the righteous teachers of the law. And the scribes, well, the scribes were the theologians, the lawyers. Again, they were thinking that they were representing God. They were, in their pride, did not see themselves as sinners that needed to repent. So Jesus is saying to the scribes, as we go through this, well, you think that you represent God and that I represent Satan. Well, let me tell you a bit about God. Let me show you how God rejoices when the lost are found. If we look now just to families back into the first century, and at that time of the teaching of Jesus, they were the foundation of society. In a household, man would have a wife or wives, children. The women who had married his sons would reside with them and their children. There could be living slaves. So it's a possibility of up to 4 generations living in community together in close proximity. These families were economically, they were self-sufficient. Families had to feed and to protect themselves. Each family needed to be productive in the family and contributing. And those roles at those times could have included ploughing fields or baking bread, tending flocks, retrieving water, and harvesting crops. And it was held in, particularly by families, held in high expectation that their sons would work and continue to work to help the family, not only to survive but to prosper into the next generation. And the villages at that time possibly could have been like Capernaum up in the north of Israel. There could have been small, tight living spaces where people lived in close proximity to each other. Everyone would have known each other. They would have known when someone was leaving the village or when they were returning. They knew when guests were arriving and when they would have been, where they would have stayed and for how long. And the neighbours knew one another. So if we now just go into the first parable, Jesus is inviting his listeners to place themselves in that story. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep. What Jesus is doing is appealing to their reasoning and to the life experiences of that audience. And as the story completes, we see the Pharisees in their pride refusing to see themselves as shameful sinners, but eagerly taking the honour and the label of being righteous. And we see that the implications for the Pharisees of their own pride, that they place themselves in a position of being the less significant group of that 99. There will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. And I'm wondering if there's a little bit of sarcasm there in the reference to the Pharisees by Jesus who do not need to repent. If we can now just look to the parable of the lost coin. The 10 silver coins refers to a piece of jewellery with 10 silver coins on it worn by brides. And looking at the parables, we can see that Jesus was turning his listeners' understanding of things upside down. The Pharisees saw themselves as being loved of God and the sinners as a refuse and of waste. Jesus, in his teaching, uses the Pharisees' prejudices against them while encouraging the sinners with one clear message. That message is that God is compassionate and loving, and God has a joyous, joyful love over the individual who is lost in this sin and who is found, who comes to a place of repentance. So Jesus makes it clear that the Pharisees, who thought they were close to God, were actually quite distant, and those sinners and those tax collectors we read of were the actual ones that God was seeking after. It's interesting now if we look at the progression, the patterns of progression in the 3 parables in Luke 15. So in this progression of value is number 1, in the parable of the sheep that is lost, then a silver coin, and followed by a son. As mentioned before, we see the power of these parables to reach an audience that functions in a shame and honour-based culture. So to lose a sheep as a shepherd would have been a very shameful thing. A coin from a piece of bridal jewellery lost in their own home would be even more shameful. The father to have a son lost would have been the worst of all, the most shameful experience in Jewish culture at that time. So if we now look at the personal progressions, and we look at that from seeking only one of 100 sheep, then we see to 1 out of 10 coins, and then 1 of 2 sons. Shows us the scope of God's personal concern for individuals. And that would have been a great comfort to the sinners that Jesus was teaching at that time, and to us today. So we see a change in the tense in each of the parables regarding rejoicing in that which was found from future tense to present and into past tense. We see in verse 7 will be more joy. There is joy in verse 10, and finally, fitting to celebrate, verse 32. Which is really saying God's acceptance of those who repent. We see some earthly references in the progression of those mentioned here to that which was lost. It's a subtle reference to sin. The sheep was lost in the open fields. The coin was lost in the dirt that was swept up. And the son was in the mud of the pigsty before coming to his senses. And then we see the relational power of each parable. The poor men, the young boys, would have related best to the shepherd and to the lost sheep. Women and teenage girls would have related best to the lost bridal coin. And the last parable dealt with everyone present by dealing with the relationship of father and a son. So if we can, moving forward as we go into Luke 15, consider placing yourself as either a sinner, as a tax collector, or as a scribe, or as a Pharisee. So the parable of the prodigal son. It could well be named or renamed the loving, gracious, forgiving and caring father. We see the father reflects the actions and the heart of God towards a repentant child. We see it's a story of 2 prodigal sons. We see the joy of the father and the joy of God in this. We'll look at that as we journey through together. It's interesting to note that the word prodigal actually means rashly or wastefully extravagant. Jesus speaks of 3 characters, 3 shameful characters, and it's seen as absolutely outrageous that Pharisees believe that this is impossible for a son to ever act this way, or for a father to act this way. So we need to place ourselves and just work this through and muse upon this as we journey through this together, looking at this from that first century perspective. So in verse 11, and he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. It's quite possible in this context, a Middle Eastern peasant, Middle Eastern class village, where shame and honour in the culture dominated at that time. Everything was done to avoid at all costs bringing shame on yourself or on your family. The absolute priority was to preserve the honour of the family and to continue in the practice of honour and to continue to do what is honourable was the thinking and the practice. And as we see a parable, a father with 2 sons. It's possible that these sons are unmarried. Their age may be upper teens, early 20s. The father had 3 groups of people working for him, slaves and hired men and servants. So it indicated that the father was a landowner and semi-wealthy, as was the family. So Let's look at verse 12. We're going to journey through to, I think, around 17, verse 17 in our time together. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property with them. We see the father respects the comment of his younger son. And we see in the context that the honour of the father dominated this culture at this time. Only an older son would have the right to make such a request. And without speaking, we see the father lets his son go. The father has, at that time, there were two ways to pass on the inheritance. One was through a will, when the father died and the property was passed to his children. And second, the father could give a gift of possession of the property to a son. That way the son could receive possession of the property. However, he was not allowed to sell it. There was a third way, and the father could give the gift of the property to the child and give the child the authority to dispose and to sell off the property, and that's what we see here. So this boy is making demands of his father. It is unheard of at this time and in this story. The son is in effect insulting his father with this request. The son's behaviour is so offensive. He's broken the 10 Commandments. He's dishonoured his family. We see the young boy's conduct as being really disrespectful, very selfish in his demand for the share of the property. It was he was saying to his father, would you just please die? Or could be seen as, well, you are dead to me. In Jewish culture, the Old Testament, where there is two sons, the eldest son will get 2/3 of the inheritance and the youngest son would get 1/3 of the inheritance, which this youngest son knew that he was entitled to. The son is really saying, look, I want my stuff. I want no accountability to you. I don't want to be subject to you. I don't want any comment from you around my life. I want no command from you, no instructions. And for the Pharisees and the scribes listening, this is absolutely outrageous. Violation of family and business relationships. The scribes could have been thinking, well, this son needs to be punished and publicly for his request. The father needs to protect his honour at all costs. And we looked at the context of the family. They had property, wealthy, they had servants, they had a fatted calf. We see the father, well, he divides. He liquidates the assets, which would have had an impact on that whole family. There was the father giving the son what he demands, and he gives to both the sons. The younger son's actions brought incredible shame and embarrassment to the family. The youngest son, in that comment we see later into Luke 15 about being dead, it's very likely that when the son left that there would have been a funeral held for him where all the village would have attended. The Pharisees believe it was such a shameful response of the father to divide the assets, and yet it was even more shameful to give in to the son's requests. You see the shame of the father abandoning his own honour and takes on the shame which would have been known to all the family and all the village. The Pharisees think that this father is weak and he's not protecting what must be protected. The older brother is not mentioned here. The older brother had a responsibility to protect his younger brother. The older brother would have had 2/3 share, and he's made no attempts to stop that younger brother. So neither son sought to protect the honour of the father. We see the father grants freedom to his son, and the son rejects him. Verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. So not many days later. That could imply that land and animals and the estate would have been sold, and sold quickly, would have been sold quite possibly cheap. The devaluing of that estate at all would have been turned into cash. And the son would have converted all that into cash. This was just unheard of by the scribes and the Pharisees listening. The father did what was outrageous and gave the son the right to sell the property. The scribes and the Pharisees are thinking, what is the father thinking? His son, his actions are unbelievable. Converts the property to cash while the father is still alive. You're saying that your property is more important to me than you are, and that I wish you were dead. Incredible, absolutely outrageous. This shame, the father has been shamed before the whole village. And the younger son's feelings towards his father is obvious to the scribe. The son is severing his relationship with his father, his family, and the entire village. It's unheard of. The son is going away alone and independently. The scribes would have expected the father to deny the son's demands, expected the father to discipline his son in anger, and even for the father to shun his son from the family for a period. And Jesus has the father in this parable to do the unthinkable. Jesus wants to convey that the father's love is radical, it is gracious towards his children. And that father's love is countercultural. The father and the father's love grants freedom to his son, who in turn rejects his father. The father doesn't protect his son from his choice. It's radical love. So this tragedy in this story is unfolding before the scribes and the Pharisees. The far country represents distance from God, both moral and spiritual. So we see this young boy has left Israel for a Gentile nation, a pagan nation. And he's gone to squander, and that's to scatter or to throw away. Wealth is all gone. And in Jewish law, for a son to squander his inheritance in the Gentile world, he could never be reinstated into a family community. The Jewish unkind attitudes towards Gentiles at that time made it even more difficult. And that word prodigal means wasteful and extravagant, wastefully extravagant. This wealth could have taken generations to build, and this son wasted all away very, very quickly in this reckless living, spent on prostitutes, sexual immorality, making poor choices, acting shamefully, disrespectful, absolute no appreciation of his father's inheritance and the value of that. And I've mentioned earlier that when that son had left home, it was likely that he was seen as good as dead to the family and to the village, and that a funeral would have been held where all that were in attendance. Verse 14, and when he had spent everything, a severe famine rose to that country, and he began to be in need. He had spent everything. This was the worst possible scenario to be found in. And then with a severe famine, the suffering is seen to be made worse. At that time, in severe famines, where there was no food, it seemed that the eating of garbage or of shoes of animals was kind of the progression in this scenario that was made the worst possible. So verse 15, so he went and hied himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. Hied himself out. This young lad with no friends, no dignity, no food, very hungry, facing death, feeding pigs, the absolute most dishonourable work a Jew could do. Maybe the young man was thinking that if he'd sought some work, that he could begin to pay back the inheritance squandered. It was an absolute disgrace for a Jewish boy to join himself to a Gentile in that role at that time. Feeding pigs amongst pig slop and amongst the stench of pig. And it's interesting when we look at the sent him, he was to get rid of the boy, just to get him away. Sent him away. In the fields to feed pigs. Well, at this point, the scribes and the Pharisees could hardly believe this. They're thinking that no one could ever be in such a bad condition as this. Jewish boys just don't feed pigs. It wasn't even in their realm of thinking or possibility. And they've got a boy feeding pigs. Verse 16, and he went and he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. The boy wasn't paid for his labour. He takes a job with a Gentile pig farmer. Absolutely no compassion is shown to him by his new neighbours. He was just a ploy to get rid of the boy. We're thinking again just how disgraceful this position is for this young boy, this lad, in a pig pen, smelling like a pig, amongst pigs. Disgraceful position, outrageous at this time. The scribes and the Pharisees are thinking here, the boy, well, he's getting what he deserves. This son is meeting his just fate. They're thinking governed by a law. That longing, boy, hungry. The pods, well, the pigs can digest carrot pods, but people can't. It makes them sick. So it is the worst possible scenario portrayed by Jesus to these Pharisees. And we see a sinner in rebellion against God. And these were typical of the sinners that were kept on coming to Jesus. Sinners that would squander every good thing and that lived reckless and evil lives, indulgent, that would bring destitution and even to death. And Jesus tells the worst type of sinner possible to see how that God might treat such a person. That was so important. How God treats the worst of the worst sinner is so important for all other sinners. That if God can forgive, well, the worst of worst sinners, then He can forgive me. And He gave him nothing. The lad was not paid for his work. In verse 17. And when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? He came to himself. He began to see himself as he really was. To himself he came. He came to his senses. He began to think about, and quite rightly, about his situation and his position. He sees his actions that have led to his situation. He recognises how far that he's fallen. He sees that he's fallen from being a son in middle-class family landowner to the lowest of low outcasts. He understands that it was his choices and his sin that put him there. And the son sees that he has sinned against his father and against God and heaven himself. And the son sees that the lowest class in the father's household, the hired man, is better than the position that he held feeding pigs. And the son comes to a true assessment of his condition, and he decides to return to his father. He makes a decision that he'll confess his sin. He'll offer no excuses. And he knows that in coming back that he's not worthy to have the status of a son. And he's not coming back to assert any rights or any demands. He knows that he's lost all of rights, all privileges, and all authority. The son has every expectation that his father will reject him, and the father has a right to shun him, to disown him. However, the risk is greater than dying in the filthy pig pen. Hired servants at that time were day labourers. They didn't belong to the family. They were not tradesmen or craftsmen. They were minimum wage earners, often shoeless, destitute and poor. And we see this son, he remembers that the father gave these day labourers more than enough. This father remembered that, this boy remembered that his father was generous and that had compassion on the poor, that his father was good. And this was the foundation for the son returning. This son is returning. Could have likely to have eaten crow. And it would be very, very humiliating for the son to return to the village, to his father. For when the son returns to the village, the whole village would have taken up the defence of that father. The village would mock and scorn the lad while defending the honour of the village. So after days of ridicule, possibly at that time after days of ridicule and scorn by the village, the father would grant the son an audience with him, where the son would kiss his father's hand. The father would then whip the boy before the whole village in some attempt to return some honour to himself. And then the father would lay out the terms and the conditions of restitution to the boy, and that there would be no reconciliation until there had been restitution. The son knew that he would have had to earn back what he had cost the family and cost his father, and the Pharisees knew this. After working several years of minimum wage, he may have been granted reconciliation. And going back for the son, not only, as I mentioned, would have been embarrassing and humiliating, the son knew that he was dying, and going back to where his father was good and that he was generous, that he had an opportunity to live. So this completes the first of the three teachings. I do want to say thank you for listening. And with that, we close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for all your great love to us. We thank you for this teaching, and we thank you in the musing and the meditation over this, that you will reveal to us who you are. In Yeshua's name.